Okay, so I want to tell you a little bit about the assumptions we're going to make about the voters' preferences. Because the underlying assumption is that the voter ranks the candidates somehow, has a particular preference ordering over the candidates, and chooses a ballot or votes for particular candidates based on those preferences. Now, it's important, there's a few things that I want you to remember. So first of all, preferring or choosing X is very different than liking or having a taste for X. One can prefer X to Y, but completely dislike both options. Many of you are probably thinking about the political situation right now, and you think, yeah, exactly, that's exactly right. I don't like any of the options in front of me, but yet I still have to come to some preference ordering over the candidates. So it's important to remember that preferring is different than just, straight out liking or desiring these two candidates, or one of the candidates over another one. Second, it's important to distinguish between ordinal information and cardinal information over the voter's preferences. So let me illustrate. Suppose that we have this voter, and the voter ranks A above B above C. And that's what we know. All we know is that the relative ranking of the different candidates is that the voter prefers A over B, and prefers B over C, and also prefers A over C, and does not have any of the reverse preferences, so is not indifferent. This is strict preference ordering. Now, from that information alone, this is the voter's ordinal information. It's just the ordering of the particular candidates. We cannot read off how much the voter prefers candidate A over candidate B relative to, say, how much the candidate prefers B over C. So we can't distinguish the situation where the candidate just likes A over B and B over C, and the differences in preference are the same, between a situation in which candidate or the voter really strongly prefers candidate A, absolutely only would vote for candidate A, and the other two candidates doesn't really like, but ranks them, thinks that B is slightly better than C, versus a situation where the voter really likes candidates A and B, but has a sort of a slight preference for candidate A over B, but strongly prefers both A and B over candidate C. So note the adjectives that I'm using. Stronger preference, only slightly prefers this candidate over the next. These type of quantitative adjectives can only be used if we have cardinal information about the voter's preferences. So in voting situations, both types of information are important. As you can imagine, a voter entering the booth that has this ranking is very different than a voter entering a voting booth that has that ranking. And it's important to distinguish both ordinal and cardinal information, and I will just try the best I can to be explicit about which type of information is relevant. And finally, it's important to distinguish between the voter's preferences and the ballot that a voter chooses in a voting situation. So think of the board account voting system, or the board account voting rule. That requires the voters to linearly rank all of the candidates. So a voter's preference, his deliberative preference, a preference he deliberates to, might be to be indifferent between all of the candidates. But in order to use board account, you have to choose a ballot that linearly ranks all of the candidates. So the ballot, even if the ballot is itself a ranking or a preference ordering over all of the candidates, it's important to distinguish that ballot from the voters' preferences. And in fact, even if the voters' preferences is a linear ordering, so it matches the ballot, there might be reasons for the voter not to choose a ballot that truthfully reflects the voters' preferences. So this would be situations of when a voter strategizes, chooses a ballot that somehow misrepresents the voter's actual preferences. We'll talk about these issues later in the course. Now, how are we going to represent the voters' preferences? The way we're going to do it is we're going to use a relation. So let X be a set of options or outcomes, or really I should say candidates. And the voter's preference is going to be represented by a relation over this set X. Now, for X and Y, for two candidates, we're going to write X is related to Y to mean that person I prefers X at least as much as Y. So I'll use the terminology weak preference ordering just to represent, to mean that, that the agent prefers X at least as much as Y. So either strictly prefers X to Y or is indifferent between X and Y. Now, for any two objects or any two candidates, if we have these two candidates sitting here and we have some voter I. Now, voter I, we can ask, what are the opinions that voter I can have about these two candidates? And there are four logical possibilities. There are four possibilities. First, the voter could strictly prefer X to Y. And that would be a situation where the voter weakly prefers X to Y. So likes X at least as much as Y, but does not like Y at least as much as X. Or the voter could have the opposite preference, could strictly prefer Y to X. So this would be a case where you have the voter prefers Y at least as much as X, but does not prefer X at least as much as Y. The third possibility is that the voter is indifferent between X and Y. So in that case, the voter likes X at least as much as Y, or prefers X at least as much as Y, and prefers Y at least as much as X. So the voter is indifferent between X and Y. And finally, the voter may not be able to compare X and Y. So the voter says, gee, I don't know. It's like comparing apples and oranges. I can't compare X and Y. And in that case, the voter does not weakly prefer X to Y and also does not weakly prefer Y to X. In this case, we say the voter cannot compare X and Y. Now, it's really important to distinguish between the third and the fourth situation. The third situation is a positive expression of the voter's preferences. The voter thought about it and is just indifferent between X and Y. Their quality, he treats the qualities of X and Y exactly the same. But in situation 4, the voter perhaps hasn't even thought about the ranking of X and Y, or X and Y just can't be compared. It's like comparing apples and oranges. Now, I'm going to give ourselves some notation for the strict preference and the indifference relation. So let XP sub IY mean person I strictly prefers X over Y, and XI sub IY mean the agent is indifferent between X and Y. Now these are relations just like the weak relation R sub I. These are just relations on our set of objects X. So they're all subsets of X cross X. But there's an important relationship between these three relations. So first of all, we can define our strict preference and our indifference from our weak preference ordering. So the agent strictly prefers X over Y if you weakly prefer X to Y, and it's not the case that you weakly prefer Y to X, and you're going to be indifferent between X and Y if you hold both of those preferences. This is as I explained on the previous page. But we can also define our weak preference ordering if we're given a strict preference ordering and an indifference relation. So our weak preference, you weakly preferred, or you prefer X at least as much as Y, just in case either you strictly prefer X to Y or you're indifferent between X and Y. So the way we mathematically set up things, we can either assume that we have the agents or the voter's strict preference relation and their indifference relation, and we define the weak preference relation from those two orderings, or we start with the agent's weak preference ordering and define strict and indifference from that ordering. So here's an example. Suppose that we have 4 candidates, A, B, C, and D. And we have our 2 voters here, voter 1 and voter 2. Now voter 1 is indifferent between A and B. Why? Well, the voter weakly prefers A over B and weakly prefers B over A. But the voter strictly prefers B to C and strictly prefers A to C. However, candidate D does not show up in this relation anywhere, so the voter cannot compare candidate D with any of the other candidates. So we might write that as voter 1 cannot compare, for example, A with D. Now what about voter 2? Voter 2 has a linear preference ordering. So voter 2 strictly prefers A to C, and strictly prefers C to B, and strictly prefers B to D, and the voter's preference relation is transitive. So implicit here is that the voter strictly prefers, for example, A to B. So this is an example, and I want to conclude by talking about what we mean when we say that the voter's preferences are rational. So rational means the preferences are reasonable. And so what we're going to do is we're going to impose certain constraints or certain assumptions on the voter's preferences. The first assumption is the assumption of comparability. And this says that any pair of alternatives, X and Y, are going to be comparable. So either the voter is going to strictly prefer X to Y, or weakly prefer Y to X, meaning that either Y is strictly preferred to X, or the agent is indifferent between X and Y. So one of these three options must obtain, meaning that the agent just can't respond, gee, I don't know, I can't compare X and Y. So this is certainly an idealization. Many of you are probably thinking, well, that's not satisfied. I have lots of friends, and when I go over and I ask them about, do you prefer this candidate over this candidate? Many of them say, I don't know. I haven't even thought about it. I don't even know who that candidate is. So it's clearly an idealization, and in fact, there are a number of literature, number of analyses that don't assume this comparability assumption. But for convenience and for many, to simplify our analysis, I am going to typically assume that our voters are maximally opinionated. They have an opinion about all of the candidates. The second assumption I'm going to make is that the voters' preference orderings are transitive. So, and this means in particular that both the indifference and your strict preference are transitive. So what does that mean? So remember, transitivity means that if you strictly prefer X to Y and you strictly prefer Y to Z, then you strictly prefer X over Z. And also, if you're indifferent between X and Y and you're indifferent between Y and Z, then you're indifferent between X and Z as well. So again, you should ask yourself, why would we make this assumption? Does this assumption make sense? Is this what it means to have rational preferences? Well, I don't want to get into these issues. I just want to point out why this is a useful idealization. So imagine that we're with an agent that doesn't have a transitive preference. So the agent's preferences, let's say strict preferences, are intransitive. Now, one piece of information that is really important when you're analyzing a voting situation is to ask the voter, who do you prefer the most? Who are your favorite candidates? The candidates that are at the top of your preference ordering. Now, if this voter I, let's say voter 1, has an intransitive preference relation, so say the agent strictly prefers A to B, strictly prefers B to C, but also strictly prefers C to A. This voter, at least if he uses this ordering to answer the question, who do you prefer the most, can't answer that question. So the voter says, okay, well, I don't know, let's say I like candidate A the best. Well, he thinks, well, no, wait a minute, I don't like A the best, actually, because I strictly prefer C to A. So actually C's my favorite. Oh, but wait a minute, I actually strictly prefer B to C, so, well, no, sorry, B's my favorite. Oh, well, wait a minute, no, I actually strictly prefer A to B, so in fact, A is my favorite. And then we're back at the beginning. You say, oh, well, wait a minute, no, sorry, C's my favorite. So this voter, if you ask this voter, who do you prefer the most, a voter with an intransitive preference can't answer that question. There is no maximal candidate. Now, I don't want to suggest that the only way to get this information, who do you prefer the most, can be from reading it off from the agent's preferences. In fact, there's a lot of interesting work which allows voters to have intransitive strict preferences, yet you still assume that you can ask this question, you can answer this question, who would you choose? Who's your favorite candidate overall? But it is convenient to assume that the voter's relation is transitive, and you can use, and because it's transitive, you can in fact answer that question. There is always a maximal element, at least when there's a finite set of candidates. Finally, we may assume that the voter's preferences satisfy a stronger assumption than comparability, namely linearity. And linearity says, for all x and y, either you strictly prefer x over y or you strictly prefer y over x. You do not allow the voter to be indifferent between x and y. So you do not allow ties. And this is convenient, for example, when you analyze board account. Board account, the ballots are in fact linear ordering over the candidates. So it's convenient to assume that the voters' preferences somehow match up with the type of ballots that they have to choose. So these are all interesting assumptions. They're certainly idealizations. Many of you might be thinking, well, God, my friends, my family, when I ask them about their preferences, it does not seem that their preferences satisfy these assumptions. So it is an interesting question. Why do I want to assume that my voters satisfy these assumptions? Why are these useful idealizations? Really going into that, answering this question, looking at this question, will take us a bit too far afield from the goals of this course. I just want to point out that we are making these assumptions. There are good reasons that we have for making these assumptions. And if you're interested in exploring these issues more, I encourage you to look at some of this literature that I'll refer to. I'll point you to interesting papers that talk about these issues, but it would be fun for you to think about reasons why you would want voters to satisfy these assumptions, comparability, transitivity, linearity, and reasons why you might not want you might not want to impose these assumptions on our voters. So these are fun things to think about. I encourage you to explore the literature and think about these issues.